St. Petersburg, the summer of 1762. A woman is standing in a courtyard before dawn, wearing a military uniform that does not belong to her. The uniform is green and gold. It belongs to the Preobrazhensky Guard, the most elite regiment in the Russian Empire. She put it on because she understood something that most people in that courtyard had not yet fully processed. Symbols matter more than documents. Her name is Catherine. She is 33 years old. She is German by birth, Russian by choice, and Empress by nothing that any lawyer in Europe could defend with a straight face. Her husband, Peter III, is the legitimate ruler of Russia. He has the bloodline. He has the crown. He has every legal argument that the 18th century knew how to make. What he does not have is the room. And Catherine has spent 17 years learning that the room is everything. By morning, the guards have chosen her. The church has blessed her. The manifesto has been read aloud in the streets of St. Petersburg. Peter, the man who was born to rule Russia, will sign his abdication within days. He will be dead within weeks. And Catherine, the woman who had no claim, no army of her own, no Romanov blood, will begin a reign that will last 34 years and reshape a continent. History will call her Catherine the Great. But greatness is not what this story is about. This story is about what it costs to take something that was never meant for you, hold it for 34 years, and make the world forget it was ever anyone else's. She took Russia, and then she refused to give it back. So the question is not whether Catherine was great. The question is harder than that. How does an outsider seize a throne, remake an empire, and still fail to free it from itself? Chapter 1. The girl Russia had to invent. Stettin, Prussia, 1729. The city is grey and cold and completely unremarkable, which is an accurate description of the political weight carried by the family living inside its castle. Sophia Augusta Frederica of Anhalt-Zerbst is born into a household that has a title but not much else. Her father is a minor Prussian general who governs a small garrison town with the quiet dedication of a man who has made his peace with irrelevance. Her mother is ambitious in the specific way that women of that era were permitted to be ambitious, entirely through the marriages and positions of the people around her, rather than through anything she might accomplish herself. Sophia grows up understanding that she is not the point. She is a piece. This is not cruelty. It is the arithmetic of the 18th century aristocracy. Minor princesses existed for one purpose, and that purpose was to be useful to someone larger. You were educated enough to be presentable, attractive enough to be desirable, and flexible enough to become whatever the negotiation required. Your opinions about this arrangement were not part of the arrangement. What nobody in that household fully accounted for was what happened when you gave a girl of exceptional intelligence nothing to do but read. Observe and think. Sophia read everything she could reach. History, philosophy, the correspondence of people who had actually changed the world. She had a memory that retained not just facts, but patterns, the way certain kinds of minds do when they have been left alone long enough to notice how things connect. She watched the adults around her manage social situations, and she filed away what worked and what did not, building an internal library of human behavior that she would spend the rest of her life expanding. She was also, from very early on, a student of want, not her own wants, which in that household were largely irrelevant, but the wants of the people around her. What did her mother want? What did the visiting dignitaries want? What did people want to hear? And what did they want to believe about themselves? And what happened when you gave them exactly that? This is not manipulation in the narrow sense. It is the skill of a person who grew up without power, learning to understand power from the outside. The way you understand a building better by walking around it than by standing inside it. She was 14 years old when the letter arrived. Remade, the Empress of Russia, Elizabeth I, was looking for a wife for her nephew and heir, the Grand Duke Peter. The requirements were specific. The girl needed to be of noble birth, but not so important that her family would make political demands. She needed to be young enough to be shaped. She needed to be Protestant, because a conversion to Russian Orthodoxy would be required, and it was easier to convert someone who had not yet built deep roots in their original faith. She needed to be in the language that was not used but was absolutely understood. Manageable. Sophia's mother saw the letter as the opportunity she had been waiting for her entire life. Sophia saw something else. She saw a door, not a door to comfort or security or even love, though she was young enough that love was still somewhere in the picture. A door to a world that was larger than Stettin, larger than minor German courts and garrison towns, and the arithmetic of being a piece in someone else's game. A door to a place where the game itself was played at a scale she had only read about. She walked through it without hesitation. What happened next is one of the most deliberate acts of self-reinvention in the history of modern Europe. And it happened in the body of a 14-year-old girl who understood exactly what she was doing, even if nobody around her fully grasped that she understood. She arrived in Russia in the winter of 1744. The cold was unlike anything she had experienced in Prussia. The court was unlike anything she had experienced anywhere. The Empress Elizabeth was brilliant and vain and suspicious and generous in unpredictable combinations. A woman who had seized her own throne through her own coup 20 years earlier, and who therefore knew better than almost anyone alive what it looked like when someone was performing loyalty rather than feeling it. Sophia performed nothing. This is the detail that most accounts of Catherine's early years get wrong. They describe her adaptation to Russia as a performance, a calculated masking of her German identity beneath a Russian costume. But what Sophia did was something more complete and more psychologically significant than performance. She did not pretend to become Russian. She decided to become Russian. There is a difference, and the difference mattered enormously. She threw herself into the Russian language with an intensity that alarmed her tutors. She would study until midnight, wake before dawn to practice, and spend her days listening to everyone around her with the focused attention of someone who understood that language was not just communication, but access. She got so sick from studying in the cold Russian nights that she developed pleurisy and nearly died. Her mother wanted to call a Lutheran pastor. Sophia refused. She asked for an Orthodox priest instead. She was still only 14. The Empress, Elizabeth noticed. The court noticed. The girl from Stettin, who was supposed to be manageable, was instead something more interesting and slightly more dangerous. She was becoming someone who actually wanted to be here. She was baptized into the Russian Orthodox faith in June of 1744. She took the name Catherine, the name Sophia. The German girl from the garrison town was set aside so completely and so finely that within a few years it would feel to her like a story about someone else. But here is what that baptism actually was. Beneath the religious ceremony and the candles and the priests and the watching court, it was a declaration, not of faith, though faith may have been part of it. It was a declaration that Catherine had chosen Russia over everything she had come from, that she was not a visitor, not a temporary presence waiting to be recalled, not a piece in someone else's game who could be moved back when the game changed. She was here. She was staying. And she was going to learn everything this country knew until she knew it better than the people born inside it. The court watched this young woman and drew the wrong conclusion. They saw adaptability and called it compliance. They saw intelligence and called it charm. They saw someone making herself useful and assumed she was making herself safe. What she was actually doing was something that would take the next 18 years to fully reveal itself. She was making herself necessary. There is a particular education that only comes from growing up without belonging, from being the outsider in every room. The person whose right to be present is always slightly conditional, always subject to the approval of people who hold the actual claim. You learn to read rooms with a precision that insiders never develop because insiders never need to. You learn to find the power in a situation before you find the comfort. You learn that the only security available to someone in your position is not acceptance, because acceptance can be withdrawn, but usefulness, because usefulness is harder to discard. Sophia had learned all of this in Stettin without knowing she was learning it. Catherine would spend the next 18 years applying it in St. Petersburg. The girl who arrived in Russia in 1744 did not exist anymore by the time the decade ended. In her place was something that had been constructed with enormous care and enormous discipline. A woman who spoke Russian without a German accent when she chose to, who knew the Orthodox liturgy with the fluency of someone raised inside it, who had read more Russian history than most Russian nobles had bothered to, who had studied the factions of the court the way a general studies a battlefield, and who understood, with a clarity that came from years of patient observation, exactly where the real power in this empire resided. It did not reside in the throne. It resided in the guards who protected the throne, in the nobles who funded the wars that kept the empire intact, in the church that told the people who God wanted them to obey, in the networks of loyalty and obligation that ran beneath the visible surface of imperial politics like underground rivers, invisible until they flooded. Catherine had mapped all of it, and she had done it while everyone around her was busy deciding that she was not particularly important. That was the first great advantage she ever had. They underestimated her. They would not get the chance to do it twice. Chapter 2. Marriage as a School of Power. The wedding took place in August of 1745. Catherine was 16 years old. Peter was 17. The celebrations lasted 10 days. Because the Empress Elizabeth believed that the scale of a celebration was a form of political communication. And what she wanted to communicate to Europe was that the Russian succession was secure. The dynasty was healthy, and the future of the empire was standing at an altar in St. Petersburg, looking like exactly what everyone needed it to look like, what it actually looked like. Behind the ceremony and the fireworks and the 10 days of banquets was two young people who had almost nothing in common, being bound together by the needs of a state that cared nothing about either of them as individuals. Peter III is one of the most misunderstood figures in this entire story, and it is worth getting him right before moving forward. Because the wrong version of Peter makes Catherine's story smaller than it actually is. The wrong version goes like this. Peter was an idiot, a drunk, a man-child who played with toy soldiers and openly admired Prussia while ruling Russia, who had no political instincts and no emotional intelligence, and who basically handed Catherine the throne through sheer incompetence. This version is convenient. It makes the coup feel inevitable, almost deserved. But it is not the complete picture. And the incomplete picture misses something important about what Catherine was actually navigating for 17 years. Peter was not stupid. He was profoundly unsuited to the role he had been forced into, which is a different thing entirely. He had been born in Germany, raised in a German court, and brought to Russia at the age of 14 to become the heir to a throne he had no preparation for and no particular desire to inherit. He was awkward in the way that people are awkward when the world they are living in does not match the world they were built for. He loved military drills and music and the company of people who did not expect him to perform imperial dignity at every moment. He was, by many accounts, capable of genuine warmth and genuine loyalty to the people he trusted. Russia was simply not one of those people, where Catherine had arrived in Russia and decided to become it. Peter arrived and never stopped being a German who happened to be living there. He did not learn Russian with any real commitment. He did not embrace orthodoxy with any visible conviction. He continued to idealize Frederick the Great of Prussia with an enthusiasm that the Russian court found, at best, embarrassing and at worst treasonous. He was a man permanently displaced from the world he understood, ruling a world he never fully grasped. And he dealt with that displacement the way many people deal with displacement, by retreating further into the things that felt familiar and rejecting the things that felt foreign. This meant that Catherine and Peter had, from the very beginning, opposite relationships with Russia. She ran toward it. He ran from it. And their marriage, which was supposed to be the foundation of a dynasty, became instead a portrait of that contradiction played out in private every single day for 17 years. The marriage was not violent. It was not characterized by the kind of dramatic cruelty that makes for easy historical narrative. It was something quieter and in some ways harder to bear. It was indifference. Peter had a mistress almost from the beginning, a woman named Elizabeth Vorontsova, who made no particular secret of the relationship. He treated Catherine not with hostility, but with a kind of casual dismissiveness that communicated, without ever quite saying, that she was furniture, present, occasionally useful. Fundamentally not the point. Catherine had two choices. She could collapse into that dismissal, become what the role seemed to demand, a decorative presence, waiting for the biological function of producing an heir, spending her years in the gilded captivity that the court offered, women who did not push against it. Or she could use the invisibility. She chose the invisibility. This is the chapter of Catherine's life that most biographies treat as a dark interval. The years to get through before the real story begins. But these 17 years were not an interruption of Catherine's formation. They were the most important part of it, because what she did with the freedom that Peter's indifference accidentally gave her was build, quietly and systematically, and without anyone fully noticing, the intellectual and political infrastructure of the ruler she intended to become. She read. The scale of her reading in these years is difficult to comprehend in the context of the 18th century court, where most noble women were not expected to engage seriously with ideas, and most did not. Catherine read Voltaire and Montesquieu and Tacitus and Bayle and the encyclopedian histories of Russia and histories of Rome and legal philosophy and political theory. She read not as a hobby but as a project, building a framework for understanding how power worked, how states were organized, how rulers succeeded and failed, what the difference was between a reign that left something behind and a reign that dissolved the moment its ruler died. She was educating herself for a job she had not yet been given and could not publicly pursue. She also built relationships. This required the most delicacy, because building political relationships in a court where your husband was the heir apparent and the Empress was watching everything was an exercise in navigation so fine that a single misstep could end everything. Catherine could not appear to be building a faction. She could not appear to be anything other than the dutiful, somewhat overlooked wife of the future emperor. But she could be charming. She could be interested in people, genuinely interested in the way that people with real curiosity are interested. And she could make people feel seen and understood and valued in a court where most interactions were purely transactional. People remembered that. People came back to it. People, slowly and without quite realizing it, began to feel that Catherine was someone worth knowing, someone whose good opinion mattered, someone who understood them in ways that the formal machinery of the court did not. She was building loyalty without ever calling it that. She had at least one child during these years. Paul, born in 1754. The moment Paul arrived, the Empress Elizabeth took him, not metaphorically, literally. Elizabeth had been waiting for an heir to the heir, and when Paul was born, she removed him from Catherine's care almost immediately, installing him in her own apartments and taking over his upbringing with the thoroughness of a woman who believed that the production of the next generation of rulers was too important to be left to the people who had produced him. Catherine barely saw her son in his first years. This is the moment in the story where you understand something essential about what Catherine's life actually was during these 17 years. She was not a powerful woman biding her time. She was a woman with no legal standing, no meaningful access to her own child, no political authority, no financial independence, and a husband who had made his indifference to her abundantly clear. The court around her watched her constantly, reported on her movements, monitored her correspondence, and waited for her to make a mistake that could be used against her. She did not make mistakes. What she did instead was something that only becomes visible in retrospect. When you look at the whole arc of these 17 years, and see the shape of what was being built beneath the surface of the decorative, overlooked, quietly reading, wife of the heir apparent, she was becoming the person that Russia would need when it needed someone. The Empress Elizabeth was aging and increasingly unwell through the 1750s. The question of what came after Elizabeth was a question that everyone at court was thinking about, and almost nobody was willing to discuss openly. Because discussing the death of an empress before she had died was the kind of thing that ended careers and sometimes ended lives. But Catherine was thinking about it, not in the sense of plotting, not yet, but in the sense of a person who has been paying close attention to a system for many years and who has begun to understand not just how the system works, but where its pressure points are. Who has real authority in Russia? The Guards regiments, who had made and unmade rulers before and would do so again. The noble families, whose land and resources made the empire function. The Church, whose blessing transformed a political act into a divine one. The bureaucracy, whose cooperation turned decisions into actions. Peter, she understood, was going to alienate all of them. Not because he was evil, because he was incapable of performing the thing that Russian power required above everything else, which was the convincing projection of belonging. Russia needed its ruler to be, or at least to appear to be, profoundly and unquestionably Russian. It needed its ruler to love the Orthodox faith, to respect the military traditions, to treat the noble families as partners rather than obstacles, to make the people who held the actual levers of power feel that their interests and the ruler's interests were aligned. She had watched him for years. She did not need more time. She could do it. She had been doing it, in smaller ways, for years. The question was not whether her moment would come. The question was whether she would be ready when it did. She was. But readiness is not the same as action. And action was still years away. Before the coup, before the crown, before the 34 years of reign that would make her Catherine the Great, there was still the long middle stretch of the education. Still, the books and the networks and the patient accumulation of the knowledge and the relationships that would make everything else possible. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being the most prepared person in a room where preparation is invisible, where what you know cannot be used yet, where the only thing you can do with everything you have built is wait, and read another book, and have another careful conversation, and add another thread to a web that nobody else can see yet. Catherine lived inside that loneliness for 17 years. She did not waste a single day of it. Chapter 3. The Education of an Outsider. There is a specific kind of mind that thrives in captivity, not the captivity of chains or cells, but the captivity of circumstance, the situation where you cannot act, cannot speak freely, cannot move toward the thing you want without risking everything. Most people in that situation contract. They focus on survival in the narrowest sense, on getting through the day without making things worse. And they let the larger questions go unanswered because the larger questions are too painful to hold when you cannot do anything about them. A few people do the opposite. They expand. They take the enforced stillness and turn it into something, a library of observation, a reservoir of understanding, a map of the world so detailed that when the moment finally comes to move, they already know every road. Catherine was one of those people. By the time the 1750s were underway, she had been living inside the Russian court for nearly a decade. She knew its rhythms, the way you know the rhythms of a place you have inhabited completely, not just the formal schedule of audiences and ceremonies and meals, but the deeper rhythms, who spoke to whom before a decision was made, and who learned about it after, which relationships were genuine and which were maintained out of obligation, where the real conversations happened and where the performed ones did, which people had influence that exceeded their official position, and which people had titles that exceeded their actual weight. She had built this map through years of what looked, from the outside, like sociability. Catherine was known in the court as charming, interested, good company. She asked questions that made people feel their answers mattered. She remembered details about people, their children, their ambitions, their grievances, the names of their estates and the outcomes of their lawsuits, and the particular things they were proud of that nobody else bothered to notice. She made people feel, in her presence, that they were being genuinely seen rather than socially processed. This was not false. Catherine was genuinely curious about people in the way that people with real intelligence are curious. Because people are interesting. Because every person is a small archive of experience and perspective that you cannot get anywhere else. But her curiosity was also functional, in a way she understood clearly. Every conversation was information. Every relationship was a thread in a web. Every person who felt warmly toward her was a person who might, at some future moment that she could not yet predict, matter enormously. She was not cold about this. Coldness would have been detectable, and detection would have been fatal. She was someone who had learned to let genuine warmth and strategic intelligence operate simultaneously, without one cancelling the other, without the warmth being false, and without the strategy being absent. This is rarer than it sounds. Most people can manage one or the other. Catherine could manage both, and the combination was, in the context of the 18th century Russian court, close to a superpower. But the relationships were only one dimension of the education. The other dimension was the books. And the books were where something deeper was happening. Catherine read Voltaire for the first time, sometime in the early 1750s. And the encounter changed the architecture of her thinking in ways she would spend the rest of her life working out. Voltaire was not just a wit or a critic. He was a systematic thinker about the relationship between reason and power, about what governments were actually for, about the difference between authority that served the people it governed and authority that simply served itself. He believed, with the particular confidence of the French Enlightenment, that the world could be made better through the application of rational thought to human institutions, that laws could be made more just, that suffering that seemed inevitable was often only the product of systems that had never been seriously examined. Catherine read this and felt something that she did not have a clean word for in any of her languages. She felt recognized, not in the sense that Voltaire was writing about her, in the sense that the framework he was building was the framework she had been developing intuitively through years of observation, the sense that power was not magic, that it operated through systems, that those systems could be understood, and that understanding them was the first step toward doing something with them. She read Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws and took notes that fill pages. Serious engagement with a serious political text. Not the appreciative skimming of someone building a cultured image, but the working annotations of someone trying to extract usable principles from a theoretical framework. Montesquieu argued that laws needed to fit the nature and circumstances of the people they governed, that there was no universal system that could be dropped onto any society from above, that the relationship between law and culture was intimate and required intimate understanding. Catherine absorbed this. She also, characteristically, noted where she disagreed. She disagreed, in particular, with the implication that despotism was necessarily the natural form of government for large territories with diverse populations. Montesquieu had used Russia as one of his examples of a nation too vast and too varied to be governed by anything other than fear. Catherine found this unsatisfying, not because she was naive about the role of fear in governance. She was not naive about anything by this point, but because she believed that fear alone was a structurally weak foundation. Fear required constant reinforcement. It produced compliance but not loyalty, obedience but not cooperation. A ruler who governed only through fear was dependent on maintaining the capacity to frighten. And the moment that capacity faltered, everything built on top of it could collapse in an afternoon. She had seen this principle illustrated in the court around her. The Empress Elizabeth governed partly through affection and partly through fear, and it was the affection that provided the stability. The fear alone could not. People who loved Elizabeth would do things for her that people who merely feared her would not. They would take risks. They would stay loyal when the calculation of self-interest pointed the other way. They would perform the small daily acts of support and cooperation that made governance actually function rather than just formally exist. Catherine wanted to be loved. She wanted it with the specific intensity of someone who had spent years being ignored, who understood exactly what it felt like to be in a room and have the room not register your presence as significant. But she also understood that love, in the political context, was not simply a feeling, but a resource that could be cultivated, that had identifiable inputs, that responded to specific kinds of treatment. She was thinking about all of this in the 1750s, while Peter was playing with toy soldiers, and Elizabeth was aging, and the court was watching carefully to see which way the wind was going to blow when the old Empress finally died. And she was making connections, not just intellectual connections, though those were happening too, Human connections. The network that she had been building through years of careful, genuine relationship management was beginning to have real weight. She had friends among the guards, officers, men who respected her intelligence and her interest in military matters, who found in her an audience that took their profession seriously in a way that the court generally did not. She had allies among the noble families who were watching Peter's behavior with increasing unease and who understood, without anyone saying it directly, that the coming reign of Peter III was going to be a problem. She had Grigory Orlov. Orlov was a guards officer, young and physically striking, and possessed of the kind of straightforward courage that Catherine found genuinely attractive after years of the court's elaborate indirectness. Their relationship began sometime around 1760 and was, from the beginning, more than personal. Orlov had brothers who were also guards officers, and the Orlov brothers had connections and influence within the guards regiments that would prove, 2 years later, to be worth more than any legal argument for succession that anyone could have constructed. Catherine did not plan the coup in these years in any formal sense. She was building options, creating conditions, making sure that if a moment came, she would have the relationships and the resources and the understanding to move quickly and decisively. The distinction matters because it tells you something true about how Catherine's intelligence actually worked. She was not a schemer in the narrow sense, spinning elaborate plots toward predetermined conclusions. She was a reader of situations who maintained enough relationships and enough understanding that she could respond to rapidly changing circumstances faster and more effectively than anyone around her. This is a skill that cannot be faked and cannot be improvised. It has to be built, slowly, through exactly the kind of patient accumulation that Catherine had been engaged in for 17 years. There is one more thread in this education that needs to be named, because it runs through everything that comes after, and it is easy to miss in the more dramatic parts of the story. Catherine learned Russia, not just the language, though the language was foundational, not just the history, though the history was essential. She learned Russia the way you learn a person you intend to spend your life with. Its textures and its contradiction, the gap between what it officially was and what it actually was, the relationship between the Orthodox faith and the political order, which was not simple and was not merely instrumental, but was a genuine fusion of religious and political identity that ran through Russian life at every level. The relationship between the noble families and the land and the people who worked it, a relationship that was the economic and social foundation of the entire imperial structure. The relationship between the military and the throne, which in Russia was not a subordinate relationship, but something closer to a partnership. The guards regiments that had put Elizabeth on the throne and could put someone else on it if they decided the current occupant was insufficient. She understood all of this not as an outsider studying a foreign system, but as someone who had decided that this system was hers and who was learning it accordingly, with the depth of ownership rather than the distance of observation. When Elizabeth died in December of 1761 and Peter became emperor, Catherine was ready in a way that Peter was not and could not have been. Peter had Russia handed to him. Catherine had built it, piece by piece. In the years when nobody was watching her closely enough to understand what she was doing, the difference between those two things was about to become very clear, and it was about to happen very fast. Chapter 4. The Coup and the Stain. Elizabeth died on Christmas Day, 1761. Peter became emperor before the candles on her coffin had gone cold. What happened in the 6 months that followed is one of the most instructive case studies in the history of political self-destruction. Not because Peter was malicious, not because he was stupid, But because he had spent 17 years failing to learn the single lesson that Catherine had spent 17 years learning above all others, power is not a possession, it is a performance. And the audience never stops watching. Peter performed catastrophically. Within weeks of taking the throne, he made the decision that would define his reign in the memory of the Russian military and the Russian nobility for generations. Russia had been fighting Prussia in the 7 Years' War, a brutal and costly conflict in which Russian soldiers had bled and died on European battlefields for years. Russia was, by the time Elizabeth died, in a position of genuine military advantage. The war was winnable. Peter ended it. He returned all conquered territories to Frederick the Great of Prussia. The king he admired above all others. The king who represented everything Peter wished he himself could be. He ended the war not because Russia's strategic interests demanded it, but because his personal admiration for Frederick demanded it. The Russian military did not forgive this. The Russian nobility did not forgive this. The people who had lost sons and brothers and fathers in those campaigns did not forgive this. And the forgiveness, or its absence, mattered enormously. Because in Russia, the throne was not held by legal documents, it was held by the consent, active or passive, of the people with the power to remove it. Peter did not understand this. He had never understood it. He moved against the Orthodox Church next. He began seizing church properties, reversing policies that the church had depended on for generations. And he did it with a brusqueness that communicated not just a political position, but a fundamental contempt for the institution and what it represented to the Russian people. He wore Prussian military uniforms in preference to Russian ones. He spoke German in court settings where Russian was expected. He kept his mistress at his side with a visibility that crossed from private arrangement into public statement, and he spoke openly about his plans for Catherine. He intended to set her aside, to divorce her or confine her to a convent, which in the 18th century were roughly equivalent fates for a woman in her position. He said these things in front of people who went immediately and told Catherine what he had said. This is the moment when the distinction between building options and making plans collapsed. Catherine had spent 17 years accumulating the relationships and the understanding and the networks that would make action possible if action became necessary. Action had become necessary. What happened on the night of June 28th? 1762 is one of those events that looks, in retrospect, almost too clean, too well executed to have been as improvised as some accounts suggest. But the speed and the decisiveness of it actually make more sense when you understand the 17 years of preparation that preceded it. Catherine was not improvising. She was executing, snapping together, pieces accumulated over years into the specific configuration that the moment required. Alexei Orlov came to her rooms before dawn. He was Grigory's brother, a guards officer with a scar across his face, and the direct manner of a man who did not waste words. He told her it was time. She dressed. She got into a carriage. She was driven to the barracks of the Izmailovsky Regiment, one of the elite guards units whose officers she had cultivated for years, whose men she had made a point of knowing, whose culture of military honor she had demonstrated, in small and consistent ways, that she respected and understood. She stepped out of the carriage. The regiment came to attention. Catherine stood before the regiment and asked for their loyalty. Not demanded. Asked. In Russian. In the language she had learned with a seriousness that no one in that regiment could question. And they gave it to her. Regiment after regiment. As word spread through the guards' barracks of St. Petersburg in the early morning hours of that June day, the soldiers coming forward and kneeling and swearing allegiance to the woman who was not their legitimate ruler and who was asking them, plainly and directly, to make her so. By the time the sun was fully up, Catherine had the guards. By midday, she had the church. The Archbishop of Novgorod blessed her in the Kazan Cathedral, and Catherine was proclaimed before God and the assembled nobility of St. Petersburg, the sole autocrat of all Russia. Peter, who had been at a summer residence outside the city when the coup began, received the news with a disbelief that slowly curdled into something more desperate. He tried to organize resistance. He could not find it. The people who might have defended him had already concluded that defending him was not worth the cost. He wrote letters. He offered concessions. He abdicated. Finally, signing the document that ended his reign with the same handwriting he had used as a child to practice his lessons, he was taken to a small estate called Ropsha, outside St. Petersburg, under the supervision of Alexei Orlov and a small group of guards, officers. He was dead within 8 days. The official account was illness. A sudden and unfortunate decline, the kind of explanation that satisfies the formal record, while satisfying almost no one who thinks about it carefully. Alexei Orlov wrote a letter to Catherine from Ropsha, a letter that has survived in fragmented form and that historians have been examining ever since. The letter appears to describe an altercation, Peter quarrelsome, and the situation slipping beyond control in ways that ended badly. Whether Catherine ordered Peter's death will never be definitively established. The evidence is ambiguous in the specific way that evidence tends to be ambiguous when the people involved had every reason to ensure it stayed that way. What can be said is this: Catherine did not punish anyone for Peter's death. She accepted the explanation of illness, issued the formal announcement, and moved forward. She was very good at moving forward. But Peter's death left a mark that moving forward could not fully erase. Not a legal mark, not an immediate political mark, a moral mark, the kind that lives in the texture of a reign rather than in its official documents. Everyone who mattered in Russia knew how Peter had died, or knew enough to have an informed opinion about it. And everyone who mattered knew that Catherine knew what they knew. This created a specific dynamic that would run through her entire reign like a current beneath still water. She could not establish her legitimacy through innocence, because innocence was not entirely credible. She would have to establish it through something harder to dispute, through achievement, through the accumulated evidence, built year by year and decision by decision, that whatever the circumstances of her accession, she was the ruler Russia needed. She could not make Russia forget that she had taken the throne, but she could give Russia reasons to be glad that she had. And there was one more thread that would run through everything, appearing and disappearing and reappearing in the years ahead, with the persistence of something that could be suppressed but never resolved. There was still a son. Paul was 7 years old when his mother became Empress. He was a Romanov child, and his existence was a permanent reminder that the line of succession had not been resolved by the coup, but merely interrupted. Catherine had taken the throne not in Paul's name, not as regent for her son, but for herself, as autocrat, as sole ruler, as the person in whom all authority resided. This meant that Paul was not the future of her dynasty in any simple sense. He was the alternative to it. The other story that Russia could tell about its rightful ruler, the story in which a Romanov child waited while his mother held power that arguably should have passed to him. She would manage this tension for 34 years, and in the end, the management would outlast her but not contain the consequences. The coup was over in hours. The stain it left would last much longer. Catherine knew this on the morning she rode through St. Petersburg in her guard's uniform, with the regiments at her back and the city watching from the windows and the doors of houses. She knew it, and she accepted it as the price of the only move available to her. The alternative to the coup was not peaceful retirement. The alternative was a convent, or worse. And Peter had made that alternative clear enough that no one paying attention could pretend otherwise. She had taken Russia because Russia, as she had come to understand it over 17 years, would not survive Peter in the way that Russia needed to survive. Whether that belief was entirely true, or whether it was also a story she told herself to make the truth more livable, is a question that does not have a clean answer. What has a clean answer is what she did next. She got to work. Chapter 5. Making Russia Forget. A usurper can be questioned. A victorious empress is harder to remove. But before Catherine could win wars abroad, she had to win a quieter war at home. A war over memory. A war over the story that Russia told itself about who was sitting on its throne and why. After the coup, everyone in Russia knew how she got the throne. The question was whether she could make them care less about that than about what she was doing with it. She understood this with a clarity that came from 17 years of watching how power actually worked beneath the surface of its official presentation. The coup had given her the throne. The throne had not given her legitimacy. Those were two different things, and only one of them could be taken by force. The other had to be built, carefully and continuously and in full public view, from the materials that Russian political culture recognized as the currencies of rightful authority. She had no time to waste. The first thing she did was get crowned properly. This sounds obvious. It was not obvious. It was a choice. And the choice communicated something. Peter had been emperor for 6 months without arranging his coronation. He had governed from St. Petersburg, the westernized city that Peter the Great had built as Russia's window to Europe, the city that felt most comfortable to someone who thought of himself as essentially European. Catherine traveled to Moscow for her coronation. Old Moscow, Orthodox Moscow, the city that was not the administrative capital but was the spiritual one, the city where Russian rulers had been crowned for centuries, where the Kremlin and its cathedrals carried the accumulated weight of Russian sacred history in their walls. She wore Russian dress. She wore the crown of the Russian Empire with a physical bearing that every account of the ceremony describes as remarkable, not the nervous performance of someone wearing something that does not belong to them, but the settled confidence of someone who has decided that it does. She moved through the Orthodox liturgy with the fluency of someone who had been practicing it for 18 years, which she had, and the assembled clergy and nobility, and the crowds who lined the streets of Moscow saw a woman who looked, in every visible particular, like someone who belonged where she was standing. This was not an accident. Every element of the coronation had been considered with the attention to symbolic detail that Catherine applied to every significant public moment. The location, the dress, the liturgical participation, the interaction with the crowd, the visible emotion at the right moments and the visible composure at the others. She was performing legitimacy with the skill of someone who had studied the performance for years before she had the stage to perform it on. But here is what was not performance. The emotion she felt in Moscow was real. Catherine genuinely loved Russia in the way that converts sometimes love the faith they have chosen more deeply than those who were born into it, because they know the cost of the choosing, and it means something specific to them that familiarity cannot provide. She had given up her name and her religion and her native language and her family and her country of origin for this. Moscow, with its golden domes and its ancient churches, and its smell of incense and cold air, and the particular quality of Russian light in September, was not a backdrop. It was the thing she had been working toward since she was 14 years old and had decided to become Russian. The crowds responded to this. Crowds are not easily fooled about the difference between performance and presence. And what they saw in Moscow was not a German empress going through the motions of Russian piety. They saw a woman who appeared to genuinely belong to the world she was inhabiting. It was the beginning of something, but only the beginning, because the coronation solved the ceremonial problem of legitimacy and not the structural one. The structural one was harder. The people who actually held power in Russia, the noble families, the guards, officers, the senior clergy, the bureaucratic apparatus that made the empire function, all of them knew exactly how Catherine had come to be standing where she was standing. The official story of Peter's sudden illness fooled no one in that room. What Catherine needed was not for these people to believe a different story. What she needed was for them to decide that the true story did not matter as much as what came after it. She began with the nobles. Peter had alienated the Russian nobility in ways both specific and general. Specifically, through his reversal of the war with Prussia, his treatment of the Orthodox Church, his public favoritism toward things German. Generally, through the manner of a man who communicated, in everything he did, that he found the people he was ruling slightly contemptible. Noble families had long memories. Catherine offered them something different. Not just respect, though respect was part of it. She offered them partnership. She consulted the senior nobles on policy questions, not because she intended to be bound by their answers, but because consultation communicated something important about how she understood her relationship with the people who made Russian governance possible. She confirmed the Charter of the Nobility, a document that formalized noble freedoms and privileges, because confirming it cost her relatively little and earned her a great deal of goodwill from the people whose cooperation she needed most. She was not naive about this. She understood that the nobles' support was conditional on their interests being served, and she factored that conditionality into every decision she made about them. But conditional support, reliably maintained, was worth more than unconditional support that existed only in theory. She moved to the church with similar care. The Orthodox Church was not simply a religious institution in 18th century Russia. It was a political one, a source of ideological legitimacy that the Russian throne had depended on for centuries. The blessing of the church transformed a political act into a sacred one, told the Russian people that God approved of the arrangement, and provided the spiritual authorization that legal arguments for any particular ruler's legitimacy could never fully provide on their own. Catherine reversed Peter's seizure of church properties, or at least moderated it significantly, communicating that the new reign would not treat the church as a resource to be stripped. She attended services with the regularity and the visible devotion of someone for whom the ritual was not a burden but a practice. She spoke to senior clergy with the deference appropriate to their position and the knowledge appropriate to someone who had actually studied the tradition she was participating in. The church found in Catherine a ruler it could work with, and then there was the military. The guards' regiments had made her empress. This created a relationship that was simultaneously her greatest strength and her most delicate, ongoing obligation. The guards knew what they had done. They knew that their choice on the morning of June 28th had determined the future of the empire. This knowledge gave them a sense of themselves as kingmakers, as the institution whose judgment about Russian rulers was, in the most practical sense, final. Catherine managed this with the attention it deserved. She was visible among the guards in ways that communicated genuine regard. She reviewed regiments personally. She learned the names of officers and remembered them. She treated military culture with the seriousness that a woman who had been reading military history for a decade could authentically demonstrate. She also paid them. The rewards distributed to the Guards' regiments in the weeks after the coup were substantial, and Catherine was clear that the rewards were connected to what the regiments had done. She was not pretending that the coup had been something other than what it was. She was acknowledging it, directly, as a transaction in which the Guards had given her something of enormous value, and she was honoring the obligation that created. This was smarter than pretense. Pretense would have been resented. Direct acknowledgement, accompanied by material reward, transformed the coup from something shameful into something the Guards could be openly proud of. But beneath all of these specific moves, something larger was happening that is harder to describe, but more important to understand. Catherine was performing a role with such completeness and such consistency that the performance began to become reality. Not in the sense that she was becoming someone she was not, in the sense that identity, at the level of a ruler and a nation, is always partly performance, and the performance, sustained long enough and credibly enough, becomes indistinguishable from the thing itself. She was not pretending to be Russian. She had chosen to be Russian years ago. She was not pretending to care about the Orthodox faith. She had practiced it for nearly 2 decades. She was not pretending to understand Russia's history and culture and political dynamics. She had studied them with the intensity of someone who understood that understanding was survival. What she was doing in the months after the coup was making all of that visible, bringing into public view the substance of what had been built in private during the years when nobody was watching carefully enough to see it. And sitting at the edge of all of it, present but not centered, managed but not resolved, was Paul. Paul was 8 years old. He was being educated by people Catherine had chosen. Growing up inside a court that his mother controlled completely, he was the heir to the throne she held, which meant he was simultaneously her successor and the living embodiment of the argument that she should not be holding the throne at all. Every time someone looked at Paul and saw a Romanov child growing up in his mother's shadow, they were reminded of the interruption, that she was a holder, not an inheritor, a possessor, not a birthright. She could not eliminate this reminder. What she could do was make the reminder seem less urgent than the present reality. Make the argument for Paul seem theoretical, while the achievement of Catherine seemed concrete. Make the future she was building look so substantial that the alternative slowly lost its power to destabilize. She could not make Russia forget the interruption, but she could fill the space the interruption had created with enough achievement that the question of whether the interruption was justified became, for most people, most of the time, less pressing than the question of what came next. What came next was the part she had been thinking about for 17 years, the part where she actually got to govern. Chapter 6. The Empress of Enlightenment. In 1763, Catherine sat down and wrote a letter to Voltaire. This was not a small act. Voltaire was the most famous intellectual in Europe, the sharpest wit and the most dangerous pen of the French Enlightenment, a man whose approval was sought by kings and whose criticism was feared by emperors. He had spent decades cataloguing the failures of European rulers, their wars, their superstitions, their tolerance of cruelty and injustice in the name of tradition. He was not easily impressed by power. Catherine impressed him. She wrote to him in French, the language of European intellectual life, with the ease and precision of someone who had been thinking in those frameworks for years. She was not writing as a supplicant seeking his blessing. She was writing as an equal, engaging his ideas directly, pushing back where she disagreed, sharing her own thinking about governance and law and the relationship between reason and authority with the confidence of someone who had genuinely worked these questions through. Voltaire was delighted. He called her the brightest star of the North. He called her Semiramis, after the legendary queen of ancient Babylon, who had built great cities and commanded armies and represented, in the classical imagination, the possibility of female power exercised at the highest level. He wrote back with the enthusiasm of a man who had found, in an unlikely place, a ruler who actually seemed to mean the things that most rulers only said. The correspondence continued for 15 years. Until Voltaire died in 1778, more than 150 letters passed between them. And here is the question that the correspondence raises. The question that runs through this entire chapter, like a current beneath still water. Was the Enlightenment Catherine projected real? Not whether she was intelligent. That is not in question. Not whether she had genuinely read Voltaire and Montesquieu and Diderot and engaged seriously with their ideas. The evidence of her writing makes that clear. The question is something harder and more significant. Did she believe in the principles of the Enlightenment as principles? As things that should actually govern the way human beings were treated and institutions were organized? Or did she believe in them as a language, the most sophisticated and respected intellectual language of her era? A language that a ruler who spoke it fluently gained access to a kind of legitimacy that military conquest and ceremonial coronation could not fully provide. The honest answer is that she believed in both, and that the two beliefs were in permanent tension with each other throughout her reign, and that understanding that tension is the only way to understand what the Enlightenment actually was in the context of Catherine's Russia. She was not a hypocrite in the simple sense. Simple hypocrisy is easy to identify because it involves saying things you know to be false in order to deceive. Catherine was doing something more difficult and more revealing than that. She was a person who genuinely held certain values and who genuinely confronted, year after year and decision after decision, the structural impossibility of fully acting on those values from where she was standing. Start with what she actually did. In 1767, she produced the Nakaz, a document of extraordinary ambition that she spent nearly 2 years writing, revising, and refining. The Nakaz was a set of instructions for a legislative commission she had convened to reform the Russian legal code, a body of law that was ancient, contradictory, and in many places grotesquely unjust. The Nakaz drew heavily on Montesquieu and on the Italian legal reformer Cesare Beccaria, whose arguments against torture and cruel punishment had recently electrified the European intellectual world. It argued for the rule of law over the arbitrary will of rulers, for punishments proportionate to crimes, for legal processes that protected the accused rather than simply serving the convenience of the state. It was, by the standards of 18th century legal thought, a remarkably progressive document. The Legislative Commission met, deliberated, argued, and ultimately produced nothing. It was dissolved in 1768 without having reformed a single significant aspect of Russian law. Catherine did not seem surprised by this outcome. This is the detail that matters most. A ruler who genuinely believed in the Nakaz as a practical program would have been devastated by its failure to produce results. Catherine moved on from the Commission's dissolution with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who had understood from the beginning that the nakaz was not primarily a legislative program. It was a statement, a demonstration to the European intellectual world that the Empress of Russia was a ruler of reason, a woman who thought seriously about law and justice and the proper relationship between the state and the individual. The statement had been made. The commission had served its purpose. She invited Diderot to St. Petersburg, the encyclopedist, the great organizer of French Enlightenment thought, came in 1773 and spent 5 months at the Russian court. They met daily. They talked for hours. Diderot was enthusiastic, energetic, sometimes physically expressive, to the point of grabbing Catherine's arm to emphasize a point, a familiarity that no one else at the Russian court would have dared, and that Catherine permitted because she genuinely enjoyed it. He pushed her on serfdom, on the condition of the Russian peasantry, on the gap between the enlightened rhetoric of her reign and the realities of Russian social structure. She pushed back, but here is what that conversation actually was. Beneath the intellectual exchange and the warmth and the mutual stimulation of two serious minds working through serious questions, it was the one moment in Catherine's public life when she was sitting across from someone who was saying, with full sincerity and without any political calculation, exactly what she already knew to be true. Diderot was not telling her anything about bondage that she had not already thought. He was not making arguments she had not already made to herself, in the private space of her own thinking, in the letters she did not send, in the policies she drafted, and then set aside when she calculated the cost of pursuing them. What would it feel like to sit there, to hear the argument you already believe made by someone who has the luxury of believing it without consequence, to know that you cannot say, not fully, not where anyone in that room could hear it, that he is right, that the system is wrong, that you know it is wrong and that you are choosing, every day, to maintain it anyway. Her argument to Diderot was not false. She told him that Russia was not France, that the conditions for serious reform required a social and educational foundation that Russia did not yet possess. That change imposed too rapidly on a society unprepared for it produced not progress, but chaos. It was a sophisticated argument. It was also, not coincidentally, an argument that conveniently aligned with the interests of the noble class whose support she depended on entirely. Diderot left Russia increasingly skeptical that enlightened conversation could overcome the structural logic of Russian despotism. He was not entirely wrong. He was also not entirely right. Because Catherine did build things that lasted, she reformed the provincial administration of Russia, creating a system of local governance that was more rational and more effective than anything that had existed before. She founded the Russian Academy of Arts, the Free Economic Society, the Smolny Institute for Noble Girls, which was the first state institution for the education of women in Russian history. She expanded the network of schools and hospitals throughout the empire. She introduced inoculation against smallpox into Russia, having herself inoculated first to demonstrate that the procedure was safe. A public act of rational courage in a country where superstition about medicine ran deep. She built the Hermitage. She was, in all of this, engaged in something that had no precise name in the political vocabulary of her era, but that we can recognize clearly from this distance. She was manufacturing a second legitimacy. The first legitimacy, the one that came from blood and legal succession and the blessing of the church, was the one she did not have and could not get. The second legitimacy was something different. It was the legitimacy of achievement, of demonstrated competence, of being so clearly the right person for the role that the question of whether you had the right to the role began to seem less urgent than the question of what you were doing with it. Every letter to Voltaire was a brick in this second legitimacy. Every institution founded, every collection assembled, every reform implemented was another brick. The structure being built was not a legal argument for her right to rule. It was a practical argument, made in actions rather than words, that Russia, under Catherine, was better governed, more prosperous, more culturally present in the world than Russia would have been under any alternative. But here is what Catherine knew, and what the Diderot conversations reveal most clearly, that she knew the second legitimacy had a foundation problem. It was being built on top of a social structure that she could not reform without dismantling the base of support that made her reign possible. The Russian nobles who cooperated with her, who provided the human infrastructure of her governance. Their cooperation was conditional, and their most fundamental interest was the system of bondage that gave them their wealth and their labor and their social position. The Enlightenment had a clear position on this. Catherine knew the Enlightenment's position. She had read every argument against servitude that the 18th century had produced. She agreed with enough of them that she could not pretend, in her private moments, that the system was defensible on the terms she claimed to value. But the system was the foundation. Touch the foundation, and the building comes down. This is the place in the story where Catherine becomes genuinely tragic, because the trap she was in was not escapable by intelligence alone. She had seized power with the support of the noble class. The noble class had given her that support in exchange for the implicit promise that their fundamental interests would be protected. The fundamental interests of the noble class depended on bondage. Therefore, she could not end it without breaking the promise that had made her reign possible. She was trapped by her own success. The more firmly she established herself, the more deeply she became embedded in the system. She could not reform. The legitimacy she was building was being constructed on top of a foundation that her own values told her was wrong. She knew this, and she kept building anyway, because the alternative was not a better world. It was a collapsed one. That calculation does not make her innocent, but it makes her something more than a hypocrite. It makes her a ruler who understood the full cost of what she was doing and chose to do it anyway. And that is a different kind of moral weight. Chapter 7. The Empire moves outward. In the same years that Catherine was writing letters to Voltaire about the nature of law and the purpose of government, she was also doing something that Voltaire preferred not to examine too carefully. She was making war. The two activities were not as contradictory as they might appear from a distance. For Catherine, war and enlightenment were not opposites. They were instruments, different instruments, suited to different problems, but both in service of the same underlying project. The project was Russia. Not Russia as it was, but Russia as she intended it to become, confident, present, impossible to ignore. A civilization that sat at the table of European power, not as a guest that Europe had grudgingly admitted, but as a permanent member whose absence would leave the table incomplete. To understand what she was reaching for, you have to understand what Russia looked like to the rest of Europe in 1762. It was large. Everyone knew it was large. But size without power is merely geography. And in the diplomatic imagination of 18th century Europe, Russia was still something slightly peripheral, a military force to be reckoned with certainly. Peter the Great had established that, but not quite a European civilization in the full sense, something northern and cold and orthodox and different, whose internal workings remained largely opaque and whose ambitions were unpredictable. Catherine intended to change every part of this picture, and she understood, with the strategic clarity that ran through everything she did, that changing the picture required not just culture and institutions and enlightened correspondence with French philosophers, it required territory. It required military victories that could not be dismissed. It required the kind of concrete, cartographic proof of power that the 18th century recognized and respected above almost everything else. She began with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, in the 1760s, still controlled the Black Sea almost entirely. Russia had no meaningful access to that sea, which meant Russia had no meaningful access to the warm water ports that would allow it to project naval power into the Mediterranean and beyond. Catherine wanted the Black Sea. She wanted Crimea. She wanted the warm water access that would transform Russia from a land power with a northern coastline into something genuinely capable of global maritime ambition. The First Russo-Turkish War began in 1768. It lasted 6 years. It was fought across an enormous geographic range, from the Danube Delta to the Aegean Sea, and it produced results that stunned Europe. The Russian Navy sailed from the Baltic around the entire European coastline, appeared in the Aegean, and destroyed the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Chesme in 1770. This was not supposed to happen. The Russian Navy was not supposed to be capable of projecting force at that distance, and the Ottoman Navy was not supposed to be vulnerable to it if it tried. Both suppositions turned out to be wrong, and the wrongness of them reverberated through European diplomatic circles in ways that changed the calculation of what Russia was and what it was capable of. The war ended with the Treaty of Küçükçayırnağı in 1774. Russia gained access to the Black Sea. Russian merchant ships gained the right to sail through the straits, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Russia gained a standing justification to intervene in Ottoman affairs whenever it chose to frame those affairs as relevant to the welfare of Orthodox populations. It was one of the most consequential diplomatic victories in Russian history. This is also where Grigory Potemkin enters the story in the fullest sense. And he deserves more than a passing mention, because understanding what Potemkin actually was to Catherine is the only way to understand the southern expansion as something other than a series of military campaigns on a map. Potemkin was physically large and intellectually restless, a man who read theology and military history with equal appetite, and who had the specific quality that Catherine found in almost nobody else around her: the willingness to disagree with her directly, and the intelligence to make the disagreement worth hearing. He argued with her, not in the way that subordinates argue with rulers, carefully and with one eye always on the exit, but in the way that equals argue, with the full weight of his own thinking brought to bear on her position, pushing back when he believed she was wrong, and not retreating from the pushback when she pushed back in return. She had spent years in a court where everyone told her what she wanted to hear. Potemkin told her what he thought. The distinction was, to Catherine, something close to oxygen. He understood what she was building in a way that required no explanation, because he was building it alongside her. When she looked at the map of the South and saw the Russia that was not yet there, he looked at the same map and saw the same thing. The shared vision was not the product of one person instructing the other. It was the product of two people whose understanding of what Russia could become was so closely aligned that the question of whose idea it had been to begin with became irrelevant in the speed of the collaboration. Their relationship was romantic, but it was also something that the 18th century had very little vocabulary for: a governing partnership between two people operating at the highest level of strategic ambition, driving each other toward what neither would have accomplished alone: the southern expansion of Russia, the annexation of Crimea, the founding of the Black Sea cities, the construction of Russian naval capacity. All of this was done in that collaboration. In 1783, Russia annexed Crimea. The Ottoman Empire protested. Europe watched. and Catherine celebrated with a journey to the new territories in 1787, inspecting the cities and the fortifications and the settlements that Russia was building on its new territory, projecting an image of accomplished permanence that communicated to everyone watching that this acquisition was not temporary and not negotiable. Every border she moved outward made the question of how she got there slightly harder to ask. Each time the Russian army moved the border, the evidence of what she was doing with the command began to outweigh the question of how she had come to give it. Poland presented a different kind of opportunity and a different kind of moral problem. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 1760s was a state in the process of destroying itself through the particular dysfunction of its constitutional arrangements. The Polish nobility had the right of liberum veto, which allowed any single member of the parliament to dissolve the entire session and nullify all legislation passed during it. The result was a political system so thoroughly paralyzed that effective governance had become nearly impossible. Catherine maintained a network of clients within the Polish nobility. She used Russian military pressure to prevent reforms that might have stabilized the Polish state. She supported the election of Stanislaw Poniatowski, a former companion, as King of Poland in 1764, placing on the Polish throne a man whose political dependence on Russian support was the defining fact of his reign. The partitions of Poland followed. In 1772, 1793, and 1795, Russia joined Prussia and Austria in dividing Polish territory among themselves, each partition taking another slice of the Commonwealth until there was nothing left. Poland ceased to exist as a sovereign state. Catherine justified the partitions in the language available to her, the language of stability and order, and the protection of Orthodox populations within Polish territory. The justifications were not entirely fabricated, but they were also not the reason for the partitions. The reason was that Poland was weak and Russia was strong, and the territory between them had value. This is the Catherine that the Voltaire correspondents preferred not to examine. The Catherine who understood that the map of Europe was not a fixed moral document, but a negotiable artifact, whose lines moved when the power behind them moved. And here is the tension that ran through these years of expansion, with a constancy that everyone at the Russian court could feel, but nobody quite had the language to name. Catherine was fighting two wars simultaneously, the war on the outside, against the Ottomans and the Swedes and the Poles and the European diplomatic order that kept trying to balance against Russian power. She was winning this war with a completeness that astonished her contemporaries. The war on the inside was more complicated, because the empire she was expanding outward was also an empire whose internal structure was being strained by the very success of the expansion. The wars required money. Money came from taxation. Taxation fell most heavily on those who could least resist it. The new territories brought new populations into an administrative structure that was already struggling to govern what it had, and in the Ural Mountains and the Volga region and the Cossack communities of the south, something was building that Catherine had not yet fully registered as the threat it was about to become. She was riding through her new southern territories when the news reached her. The empire was burning from within. His name was Yemelyan Pugachev. He claimed to be Peter III, and he had an army. Chapter 8. The Empire Burns Within. He appeared in the autumn of 1773 on the Yaik River, in the borderlands east of the Volga, where the Russian Empire frayed at its edges into something that the maps called Russian territory, but that functioned, in practice, according to its own logic and its own grievances. His name was Yemelyan Pugachev. He was a Don Cossack, a former soldier who had fought in the 7 Years' War and the First Russo-Turkish War, and who had accumulated, through years of moving through the margins of the empire, a precise and detailed understanding of what the margins felt like from the inside. He was not educated in the formal sense. He was educated in the way that men become educated when the world they inhabit is genuinely dangerous and the cost of misreading a situation is paid in blood. He announced that he was Peter III, not the Peter who had signed an abdication document in 1762 and died 8 days later at Ropsha. The real Peter, the Tsar who had been hidden away by his enemies, protected by loyal men, waiting for the moment when Russia would be ready to receive him back. He had a program. He promised the Cossacks their ancient freedoms that the expanding Russian state had been systematically curtailing for decades. He promised the serfs their liberation. He promised the borderland peoples recognition of their traditions and relief from the taxes and the conscription and the administrative impositions that the empire pressed on them with increasing weight. He was lying about being Peter. Almost certainly, everyone who followed him knew he was lying. That was not the point. The point was that the lie gave the movement a shape that Russian political culture could recognize. A legitimate Tsar, wrongfully removed by an illegitimate usurper. A ruler of the people coming to reclaim his throne from the foreign woman who had stolen it. The story was not new. Russia had seen pretenders before. But Pugachev deployed the story with a skill and a timing that transformed it from a local grievance into something that threatened the structural foundations of Catherine's empire. Because the people who followed him were not following a story. They were following a set of promises that addressed real conditions of real desperation. The people of the Volga region and the Ural territories lived inside a system that had been tightening for a century. The noble class, whose support Catherine had cultivated so carefully, and whose interests she had so consistently protected, had been using that protection to expand their power over the people who worked their land. Those who had once had customary rights, informal protections, traditional limits on what their lords could demand of them, had watched those protections erode decade by decade as the legal framework was clarified and extended and made more explicitly an instrument of noble power rather than a mutual obligation between classes. By the 1770s, someone bound to a Russian noble estate had so few effective protections that the language of ownership was no longer merely metaphorical when applied to human beings. They could be beaten, sold, separated from their families, required to perform whatever labor their lord demanded. They had no legal recourse. They had no political voice. They had no mechanism for addressing their condition except patience or flight or violence. Pugachev offered them violence with a framework. He moved fast. Pugachev's forces swept through the Ural industrial towns, where workers in the mines and foundries had grievances that overlapped with, but were distinct from those who worked the agricultural land. They took fortresses. They executed nobles and government officials with a methodical thoroughness that communicated purpose rather than mere rage. They established courts, issued decrees, organized supply lines, maintained the discipline of a force with actual military objectives. By the spring of 1774, Pugachev controlled a vast territory stretching from the Ural Mountains toward the Volga. His army numbered in the tens of thousands. He had artillery. He had officers. He had a functioning administration. He had the attention of Catherine in a way that nothing in her reign had yet demanded it. She was in the middle of the war with the Ottomans. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca was being negotiated in the very months when Pugachev's rebellion was reaching its peak intensity. She was managing a war on the southern frontier and a rebellion in the interior simultaneously. With the resources of a state that had not yet fully developed the capacity to fight in two directions at once, she sent her best general, Alexander Suvorov. To deal with Pugachev, Suvorov was tactically brilliant, brutally efficient, capable of moving forces across difficult terrain at speeds that opponents consistently failed to anticipate. He was asked to end the rebellion, and he brought to that task the focused competence of someone who understood exactly what ending a rebellion required. The rebel army was defeated in August of 1774. Pugachev was captured, brought to Moscow in a cage, tried, and executed in January of 1775. But something had happened to Catherine in the months between the rebellion's peak and its suppression that did not end when Pugachev was executed. Something had shifted in the way she understood her own empire, and the shift was permanent. She had known, in the abstract, that the conditions of Russian bondage were dangerous. Pugachev made the abstract concrete. What she saw in the rebellion was not simply a military threat that had been contained. She saw the true shape of the thing that lay beneath the surface of her empire. The accumulated rage of people whose condition her enlightened rhetoric had not touched, and whose patience her expanding borders had not renewed. She saw what they were willing to do when someone gave them the language and the organization to act on what they thought, and she saw how quickly it could all come apart. Pugachev taught Catherine two things simultaneously. The system of bondage was dangerous, and the only class capable of containing that danger was the class that benefited from it. That was the trap. She had seen it clearly. She chose to stay inside it, because the people who had suppressed the rebellion were the nobles, their local militias, their management of their estates, their ability to identify and contain the early stages of unrest before it could spread. All of this had been essential to the eventual suppression. The Russian state, without the cooperation of the noble class, was not capable of governing the vast territory it claimed to govern. Touch the system of bondage seriously, and you touch the nobility. Touch the nobility seriously, and you lose the people who make the empire governable. Lose them, and you get not gradual reform, but accelerating chaos. The exact chaos that Pugachev had demonstrated was waiting beneath the surface whenever the surface was disturbed. The conclusion was brutal in its pragmatism and devastating in its implications for everything she claimed to believe. Order first. Always order first. After Pugachev, Catherine reorganized the provincial administration of Russia, creating a more robust system of local governance. The reform was genuinely useful. It also gave the noble class a more formalized and legally secure role in local administration. The people who had failed to prevent Pugachev were given more authority over the conditions that produced him. In 1785, the Charter of the Nobility confirmed and expanded the privileges of the noble class, with a comprehensiveness that left no ambiguity about where Catherine stood on the question of who mattered most to the stability of her regime. She stopped writing to Voltaire about reforming the foundations of Russian society. She did not stop believing that it needed reforming. The private notes suggest she understood the contradiction with full clarity and felt its weight. But she stopped performing the belief in public, because the performance had become too expensive. Every time she said publicly that bondage was a problem she wanted to address, she was creating an expectation she had no intention of meeting. And expectations you do not meet are more damaging than expectations you never create. Better to be silent about it. Pugachev was dead. His body had been publicly displayed in Moscow to communicate, with the directness that public execution always communicates, that the state was capable of protecting itself. The serfs were still serfs. The nobles were more powerful than before, and Catherine returned to St. Petersburg and to the business of building the greatest reign in Russian history on top of a foundation she now knew, with a certainty that Pugachev had burned into her understanding permanently. was capable of producing the thing that had very nearly consumed everything she had built. She had looked into the fire. She had chosen order, and she would spend the remaining years of her reign governing with the particular combination of genuine achievement and deliberate blindness. That is, the specific signature of a person who understands the contradiction they are living inside and has decided that understanding it is enough. It was not enough, but it was what she had. Chapter 9. What she actually built. Accounting is not the same thing as memory. What a ruler builds is one thing. What history chooses to keep is another. Before this story reaches its final question, before it follows the memory into the distortions that came after, it owes Catherine something that her critics rarely give her, and her admirers rarely frame correctly. The honest accounting, not the accounting that adds up her achievements and declares her great, not the accounting that subtracts her failures and declares her a hypocrite. The accounting that looks at what was actually there before she arrived and what was actually there when she died, and measures the distance between those 2 points with the precision that the subject deserves. Consider first what Europe could see. Russia, in 1762, was a great power in the way that a large and dangerous animal is powerful. Its size was real. Its military capacity was real. But it was not a civilization that Europe took seriously on its own terms. It was a force to be managed, a variable to be factored into diplomatic calculations, a place whose internal workings remained largely opaque to the educated classes of France and Britain, and the German states who set the cultural standards of the 18th century world. Russia, in 1796, when Catherine died, was something different. The territory alone tells part of the story. During her reign, Russia expanded by roughly 200,000 square miles, absorbing Crimea, significant portions of Poland, territories along the Black Sea coast, and various borderland regions whose incorporation into the empire changed the strategic geography of Eastern Europe permanently. But the Hermitage tells a larger part. Catherine purchased the collection of the Berlin merchant Johann Ernst Gotskowski in 1764. 225 paintings that formed the foundation of what would become one of the greatest art museums in human history. She kept buying. She acquired the collections of Count Brule of Dresden, of Pierre Crozat's heirs in Paris, of Sir Robert Walpole's Descendants in Britain, works by Rembrandt and Rubens and Van Dyck and Raphael and hundreds of other artists, assembled with the eye of someone who was not simply spending money but making an argument. The argument was that St. Petersburg was a European capital, that Russia was a European civilization, that a nation whose empress owned more Rembrandts than most European monarchs could claim membership in the world that Rembrandt represented. When Voltaire defended Catherine to his readers, he was not simply flattering a powerful patron. He was helping construct an image of Russia as a place where reason was taken seriously, an image that changed the diplomatic and cultural context in which Russia operated. Consider next what Russia could use. The Smolny Institute, opened in St. Petersburg in 1764, the first state-funded institution for the education of women in Russian history. She founded hospitals with ongoing funding and administration. She introduced systematic inoculation against smallpox, personally submitting to the procedure in 1768, when it was still sufficiently novel and sufficiently feared that her willingness to undergo it publicly was itself a form of governance. She reformed the provincial administration of Russia, creating a system of local governance that was more rational and more effective than anything that had existed before. She created the Free Economic Society in 1765, the first learned society in Russian history dedicated to the study of agriculture and economics. She built cities. Odessa, which would become one of the great port cities of the Black Sea world, was founded during her reign. Sevastopol, the naval base that would anchor Russian power in Crimea for generations, was established on her orders. She governed. This sounds obvious, but governing an empire the size of Russia in the 18th century, governing it for 34 years with the continuous attention and the consistent decision-making that the record shows, was itself an achievement of a kind that is easy to undervalue because it produced no single dramatic monument. It produced stability. It produced an administrative culture that sustained the expansion and the wars and the cultural projects simultaneously. It produced the unremarkable miracle of a large and complex state that kept working, year after year, through the crises and the wars and the rebellions and the diplomatic challenges that any major power accumulates across 3.5 decades. Now consider what made all of it possible. And here is where the accounting becomes genuinely hard. The Hermitage is one of the greatest museums in the world. It was built in a country where tens of millions of people lived under forms of bondage or legal dependency. The Smolny Institute educated noble girls. The daughters of those bound to the land had almost no meaningful access to anything comparable. The provincial reform rationalized local administration. It also formalized the authority of local nobles over the people beneath them in ways that made the system more efficient and therefore more durable. The cities Catherine founded were built with conscripted and coerced labor in conditions that the enlightened Empress who commissioned the buildings preferred not to examine too closely. Every achievement in the list exists inside this context, not as a way of cancelling the achievement, not as a reason to dismiss what was built, but as the structural fact that gives the question its bite. Catherine built a more enlightened Russia. She built it on an unenlightened foundation, and the foundation was not incidental to the building. It was the condition of the building. The Hermitage required the tax revenues that bondage made possible. The wars that expanded the empire required the armies that the system supplied. The stability that allowed the cultural projects to proceed required the noble cooperation that the system sustained. Remove the foundation, and you do not get the building without the moral problem. You get no building at all. This is what makes Catherine's achievement genuinely tragic, rather than simply compromised. She was not a ruler who could have done everything she did, and also freed the foundation. She was a ruler who could either do what she did or transform the foundation, and she chose what she did. The greatness is real. The asterisk is real. And the distance between them is not a flaw in the accounting. It is the accounting. Grigory Potemkin died in 1791, on a road in Moldavia, his body failing from the illnesses that had accumulated over years of campaigning in difficult conditions. Catherine received the news in St. Petersburg and, by the accounts of people present at court, was devastated in a way that she rarely allowed herself to be devastated in public. She grieved him for the rest of her life, not because he had been her companion, because he had been the person who understood what she was trying to build with the completeness of someone who was building it alongside her. That is a different kind of loss, and it is the kind that does not fill. Chapter 10. The Men, the Myths, and the Memory. Catherine died on November 17th, 1796. She had suffered a stroke the previous day, collapsing in her dressing room in the early morning hours and never fully regaining consciousness. She was 67 years old. She had been governing Russia for 34 years. She died in the same empire she had seized, expanded, and spent her entire reign trying to make worthy of her ambitions. For it, The manner of her death was completely ordinary. The manner in which history chose to remember her death was not. Within years of her death, and accelerating in the decades that followed, a story began circulating about the circumstances of her final hours that was so lurid and so specifically disconnected from any credible evidence that its persistence across 2 centuries says something important, not about Catherine, but about the people who kept repeating it and the culture that kept receiving it with such evident appetite. The story involved a horse. It was entirely fabricated. The actual Catherine died of a stroke in her dressing room, attended by her physician and her court. There was nothing unusual about the circumstances. A 67-year-old woman who had lived an extraordinarily full and extraordinarily demanding life had a stroke and died. But the fabricated story persisted. It spread. It was repeated in court gossip and popular pamphlets, and eventually in the kind of casual historical reference that passes as knowledge without requiring verification. It became, for many people, across many generations, the first thing they associated with the name Catherine the Great. Think about what that means. One of the most consequential rulers in the history of Europe, a woman who expanded Russia by 200,000 square miles, founded the institution that became the Hermitage, created the first state-funded education for women in Russian history, conducted one of the most remarkable correspondences in the intellectual history of the 18th century, governed the largest country on earth for 34 years. And the thing that stuck was a lie about a horse. This did not happen by accident. Start with what is true about Catherine's private life, because the truth is interesting enough that the fabrications are not necessary, and their persistence alongside the truth is itself revealing. Catherine had relationships with men throughout her adult life. After the collapse of her marriage to Peter, she chose her companions with the agency of a woman who had decided that the terms of her personal life were hers to determine. She had a long relationship with Grigory Orlov, the guards officer whose brothers had been essential to the coup. She had the governing partnership with Potemkin that this story has already described. She had other companions after Potemkin, chosen with a directness that made no attempt to disguise the nature of the choice. The relationships were known to the court. They generated comment and occasional diplomatic calculation, because a new companion at the Russian court was a political event with implications for patronage and access and the balance of influence around the Empress. In this, the relationships were no different from the relationships that male rulers of the same era conducted openly and without significant comment. Frederick the Great had companions whose existence was acknowledged with the discretion that the era applied to such things. Louis XV had a succession of official mistresses whose influence on French court politics was tracked carefully by every diplomat in Paris. Peter the Great had relationships that were conducted with an openness that bordered on ostentation. None of these men were remembered primarily through the lens of their private lives. Catherine was. The double standard was not subtle, and it was not unconscious. It was the application of a set of rules that the 18th century held with particular rigidity. Rules about what female power was permitted to look like, and what it meant when a woman exercised power in ways that exceeded those permissions. A male ruler who chose his companions was exercising appetite, which was considered appropriate to power. A female ruler who chose her companions was demonstrating that her judgment was compromised by desire, which was considered dangerous in a ruler, and evidence of something specifically female that made the female ruler inherently less trustworthy than the male one. This was the frame that Catherine's contemporaries applied to her private life. It was the frame that much of subsequent history inherited and elaborated. The Prussian court was particularly energetic in producing and spreading unflattering stories about Catherine. Frederick the Great, who corresponded with Catherine with apparent warmth, and who had every reason to understand her intelligence and her capability, also produced, in private letters and in the gossip of his court, a portrait of her that reduced the Empress of Russia to a figure of appetite insufficiently controlled by the dignity appropriate to her position. He had reasons for this that had nothing to do with the truth of what he was saying. A Catherine reduced to her companions was a Catherine whose political decisions could be attributed to personal influences rather than strategic thinking. A Catherine whose reputation was entangled with stories about her private life was slightly easier to manage diplomatically, because managing someone's reputation was easier than contesting their arguments. You cannot easily argue that Catherine was wrong about Crimea. The strategic logic was sound by the standards of 18th century great power competition, and the diplomatic execution was masterful. You cannot easily argue that the Hermitage was a bad idea. You cannot easily argue that the Smolny Institute should not have been founded. But you can tell a story about a horse. The mechanism works by displacement, by substituting a story about the body for a story about the mind, by making the personal so vivid and so memorable that the political becomes background. The paintings remained, the cities remained, the borders remained. Odessa was on the map. The Hermitage was standing. Sevastopol was a port. The Smolny Institute was open. But in the popular imagination, the body kept returning first. This mechanism is not unique to Catherine. It is the standard operating procedure that history has applied to women who accumulated power that the systems around them were not designed to accommodate. 2 centuries after her death, in popular culture, in casual historical reference, in the way her name is used in conversation by people who have no particular investment in Russian history, the associations that cluster around Catherine the Great are disproportionately personal rather than political. Not the Hermitage, not Crimea, not the Smolny Institute, not 34 years of governing the largest country on earth, the companions, the rumors, the horse. During her reign, Catherine was aware of the stories being told about her. She responded to this awareness in a way that was characteristic of how she responded to most things she could not directly confront. She performed around it. She cultivated the image of the enlightened Empress with particular energy, in part because the enlightened Empress was a figure whose authority derived from her mind rather than her body, from her correspondence with philosophers, and her founding of institutions, and her military victories, and her administrative reforms. The performance of enlightenment was also a performance of a particular kind of female legitimacy, the legitimacy of demonstrated intelligence, which was the only legitimacy available to a woman in her position that could not be easily reduced to questions about her personal life. She was fighting the story about her body with the story about her mind. She won, mostly, in her own lifetime. The rulers of Europe who dealt with her on her own terms, as a great power, sovereign, whose opinions and decisions and military capabilities commanded genuine respect, but she lost in the longer term, after her death, without the performance to sustain the competing frame. The gossip moved into the vacuum and filled it with the thoroughness that gossip always achieves when the person it concerns is no longer present to contest it. The reduction of Potemkin is part of this same story. Any honest account of Catherine's reign has to name what Potemkin actually was. Not her companion, her greatest political partner, the southern expansion of Russia, the annexation of Crimea, the founding of the Black Sea cities. All of this was done in collaboration with Potemkin, through a partnership of 2 people who were operating at the highest level of strategic ambition and who drove each other to exceed what either would have accomplished alone. The relationship was romantic, It was also something that the 18th century had very little vocabulary for: a governing partnership between a female ruler and a male subordinate, in which the governing was the central fact. The only frame available was personal, and so the personal frame was applied. And in that frame, Potemkin became another entry in the list of Catherine's companions, rather than what he actually was. The reduction is not a minor error. It is the systematic misreading of a governing relationship as a personal one, because the people doing the reading had no frame for taking seriously the governing relationship between a woman in power and the men around her. Catherine was not a paradox in the sense of being inexplicable. She was a person who held genuine values and faced genuine structural constraints on acting on those values, who made choices about which constraints to accept and which to resist, who built real things and left real costs behind, and who did all of this in a world that had prepared almost nothing for someone like her. What makes Catherine's version of it worth studying is the scale at which she operated, the intelligence she brought to it, and the specific form that the distortion of her legacy took. She built one of the great reigns of the modern era. History remembered her companions, and the distance between those two things is not about Catherine. It is about what we choose to see when we look at a powerful woman, and what we choose not to. Paul I became Emperor of Russia on November 17th, 1796, the day his mother died. He was 42 years old. He had been waiting for this day for 34 years. That waiting had not been gentle. Paul had grown up inside the court of a mother who loved him in the way that people love the things that also represent their greatest vulnerability, who educated him carefully and kept him close, and managed his relationships and his image with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that her son was simultaneously her heir and the most persistent argument against her right to hold the throne she held. He had watched his mother govern an empire from a position of permanent adjacency, close enough to observe everything and far enough from power. That observation was all he could do. He had formed opinions. They were not warm ones. Paul believed, with the conviction of a man who had spent decades turning a grievance over in his mind until it had acquired the weight of certainty, that his mother had stolen something, not just the throne, though the throne was part of it. She had stolen the narrative, the story of what Russia was and what it was supposed to become. She had imposed her version of Russia on the country for 34 years. Her enlightenment and her expansion, and her noble alliances, and her cultural projects, and her careful management of the story, she wanted history to tell about her reign. And in doing so, she had pushed aside the version of Russia that Paul believed was the legitimate one. He had his father's memory to tend. Peter III, the man Catherine had overthrown, and who had died 8 days later in circumstances that satisfied no one who examined them carefully, was Paul's father, or the man officially designated as such. Whatever the biological reality, the political reality was clear. Paul was the son of the man Catherine had removed. He was the living continuation of the interrupted legitimacy that the coup of 1762 had displaced. He had never forgiven her for it. This is the thread that has been running through the entire story, planted at the moment of the coup and growing, quietly and persistently, through every chapter of Catherine's reign. There was still a son. The phrase dropped into the story after Peter's death and then receded into the background as Catherine built and expanded and performed and achieved. But it never disappeared. Paul was always there, always growing older, always watching, and always understanding that his existence was the one thing Catherine could not fully manage. She could manage the nobles, She could manage the church. She could manage the military, the diplomats, the philosophers, the foreign courts, the rebellions, the wars. She could manage her own image with a consistency and a skill that was, across 34 years, extraordinary. She could not manage the fact of Paul. He was the alternative that could not be eliminated, the legitimate heir, who had been set aside not by law, but by the force of her personality and her capability, and the choices of the people who had decided, on the morning of June 28th, 1762, that Catherine was a better bet than Peter. Paul disagreed. On the day he became emperor, he moved with the speed of a man who had been rehearsing this moment in his imagination for decades. He ordered that his father's remains be exhumed and reburied with the honors appropriate to a Tsar. He required the people who had participated in the coup of 1762, the surviving guards officers, the nobles who had made Catherine Empress, to walk in the funeral procession, carrying the symbols of their complicity. He forced the court to mourn publicly for a man who had been dead for 34 years, to perform the grief that the official version of his death had made impossible to perform at the time. It was a deliberate and methodical act of historical revision. Paul was rewriting the story, putting Peter back into it, making the court acknowledge, in the most public and the most humiliating way available to him, that what had happened in 1762 was not the smooth transfer of power to a more capable ruler, but an interruption that his father's son was now correcting. He reversed Catherine's policies with a systematic thoroughness that communicated more than policy disagreement. He restricted the privileges of the noble class that Catherine had cultivated and depended on. He reimposed obligations on nobles that Catherine's charter of the nobility had removed. He reorganized the military along lines he preferred, and Catherine had not. He withdrew Russia from the coalitions and the diplomatic arrangements that Catherine had carefully constructed over decades. He was not simply governing differently from his mother. He was governing against her. And the court that had served Catherine, the nobles and the officers and the bureaucrats who had been the human machinery of her reign, watched this with the particular unease of people who understood that the world they had built their lives around was being taken apart piece by piece by a man who had very good reasons to resent every piece of it. They began, carefully and then less carefully, to consider their options. Russia had a history of solving the problem of an emperor who had lost the confidence of the people with actual power. And the solution Russia had historically reached for was not constitutional reform or formal impeachment. The solution Russia reached for was the same solution that had put Catherine on the throne in 1762, a guards officers meeting in a closed room, a conversation about what came next, a decision made by the people who had the physical proximity to power and the willingness to use it. Paul was murdered on the night of March 23rd, 1801. He was killed in his bedroom in St. Michael's Castle, strangled by a group of guards, officers, and nobles who had decided that his reign had become a problem requiring a permanent solution. He had been emperor for 4 years and 4 months. His son Alexander became Tsar the following morning. Alexander was 23 years old. He had known about the conspiracy. Whether he had sanctioned it directly or simply declined to prevent it is a question that his reign, which lasted until 1825, and which was consumed in part by the guilt of what had happened in that bedroom, never fully answered. The machinery that Catherine had built, the machinery of noble power and guards, regiment, influence, and the understanding that the throne was ultimately held at the pleasure of the people with the physical capacity to take it away. That machinery had consumed her son. She built a system strong enough to hold an empire, and too dangerous to hold her own son. Now step back from Paul's death and look at the whole shape of what the story of Catherine and Paul together reveals. Because together they reveal something that neither one reveals alone. Catherine's reign was built on a proposition. The proposition was that legitimacy could be manufactured, that a ruler who had no blood claim to the throne could establish a claim through achievement, through capability, through the accumulated evidence of competence and vision, and the practical results of 34 years of governing well enough that the question of whether she had the right to govern became less urgent than the evidence of what she had done with the governing. The proposition worked for Catherine. It worked because Catherine was exceptional, because the intelligence and the discipline and the patience and the political skill she brought to the project of manufacturing legitimacy were genuinely extraordinary. The proposition did not work for Paul. Paul had the legitimacy that Catherine had lacked. He had the blood, the Romanov inheritance, the legal claim that no coup had interrupted. He had the thing his mother had spent her entire reign trying to manufacture. And it was not enough, because the system Catherine had built in the process of manufacturing her legitimacy had its own logic, its own requirements, its own understanding of what a ruler needed to provide. The system expected to be maintained. It expected its interests to be respected. It expected the ruler at its center to perform the role with enough competence and enough sensitivity to the people who made the system function that they would choose to keep the system and its ruler together. Paul could not do this. Paul was too consumed by his grievance, too focused on reversing the past, too caught in the logic of restoring what he understood as the legitimate order to attend to the practical requirements of maintaining the system that made any order possible. He was killed by the same mechanism that had made his mother Empress. In the end, Catherine's greatest achievement and her greatest legacy were the same thing. She had demonstrated that in Russia, power belonged not to the bloodline, but to the person who could make the room believe they were necessary, that the throne was not inherited but performed, that a ruler who lost the performance lost everything, regardless of how they had come to be performing in the first place. This was a lesson she had learned at 14, in the court of Elizabeth. Watching a world organized entirely around the question of who could make themselves indispensable to the people who mattered, she had spent her entire life applying it. She had applied it so successfully and so completely that the lesson had been baked into the institutional structure of the Russian state in ways that outlasted her reign and shaped the reign that followed. Paul learned it the hard way. Catherine never had to learn it because she had always known it. She had arrived in Russia as a girl from a garrison town, with nothing but intelligence and will, and the particular education of someone who had grown up, understanding that belonging was not given, but made. She had made it. For 34 years, through everything this story has covered, the coup and the wars and the Enlightenment and Pugachev and the Hermitage and the bondage and the correspondence and the expansion and the companions and the lies, she had made it every single day, with the consistency and the discipline and the occasional ruthlessness of someone who understood that the alternative to making it was losing it, and that losing it, for a woman in her position, in her century, in her empire, was not an abstract political setback. It was erasure. She had refused to be erased. And so she had seized Russia, and remade it, and expanded it, and performed it, and enlightened it within the limits of what could be enlightened without destroying the foundation, and built on it one of the most consequential reigns in Russian history, and she had not freed it. This is where the story lands. Not on the greatness, which is real, not on the failure, which is also real, on the specific and permanent tension between the two, The tension that Catherine lived inside every day of her reign, and that the reign itself made permanent in the structure of the Russian state. She wanted to be the Empress of Enlightenment. She was the Empress of what was possible. She took Russia. She refused to give it back. In the end, that refusal was both the source of everything she achieved and the boundary of everything she could not. The woman who stood in that courtyard before dawn, wearing a uniform that did not belong to her, understanding that symbols matter more than documents, already knew this. She did not need anyone to explain to her that power was not given. It was taken, and then proved, and then taken again the next day, and proved again, until the taking and the proving became so continuous and so complete that no one remembered it had ever been otherwise. The throne she made look like destiny, never forgot that it began as an act of will, and neither should we.